Really, when you think about it, it's just good business. This is 15% of the world's population. If you're building products that they can't even use, you're losing business. There's something called the curb cut effect that basically is the phenomenon where if you design for people with disabilities, everyone benefits, and it is things like curb cuts that were originally designed for wheelchairs. All of a sudden, families pushing strollers and skateboarders are like, wow, this is convenient. Inclusive communication tools, so like having live captioning in meetings, accessible documents. Microsoft implemented that when they started doing their disability and neurodiversity hiring programs for people with disabilities. And then they did a survey across the whole company and found that 72% of their employees found that the captions helped them focus better and retain information, regardless of hearing ability. Elevators, so many things that you would never guess were designed for people from this community were, and they benefit everyone. And organizations that are getting ahead of it are already starting to see quick wins. And it's not just oh, we got to do this to be compliant and not get fined or lose business. It's actually helping them get more business.
Hi there, I'm Denise Chaffin, and I am your podcast host for Talking TA. And today I have with me Weslie Ricks. Weslie, welcome, welcome. Weslie is our global accessibility and disability consultant, and her company is Divergent Talent Consulting. So, without further ado, Weslie, I'm going to let you kind of go into a little bit about your background and what you do.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me. As you said, I am focused on disability inclusion and accessibility. So that's anything from physical accessibility to digital accessibility as well. And I really got started in this work because of a personal passion for it. I am neurodivergent, and then I have three children. My daughter and son are autistic, and my daughter is actually a hearing aid user. And kind of through that journey with them, seeing the barriers that are in place for them, not necessarily because of who they are, but because how the world was built, it's made me very passionate about kind of breaking down some of those barriers and helping, especially organizations and big organizations, support employees with disabilities and hire this talent because they're largely underrepresented in the workforce.
Now, you're working with clients now, and you're working with, is it their talent management departments as a consultant, or who is it you're actually working with on the human resource side?
Yeah, so my work is split between working with individuals who are disabled and helping coach them to find work and maintain that work. But on the business side, it's really broad. Sometimes it's HR teams, sometimes it's legal teams, a lot of times it's leadership trainings because a lot of the behaviors and barriers as to why companies don't hire this talent is due to culture differences. And for example, like hiring people for a culture fit when that is really just, I want to have a beer with this person. And when, again, 80% of people with disabilities are unemployed, a lot of that representation isn't currently in the workforce. So those processes put a lot of barriers in place. So teaching leaders how to be open to people who communicate differently, who learn differently, and look different in order to really help them innovate and also help the rest of their teammates. A lot of people who are neurodivergent are in people's teams today. They just don't know it yet, and they haven't disclosed that because they don't feel safe. So it's really working with those leaders to create those safe spaces so that they can support the talent they already have and bring in new talent from these communities.
Wow. I guess my first question, then, based on what you're telling me, is when people are afraid to identify themselves as neurodivergent, can you kind of give us a list of what some of the qualities are, or what some of the attributes are for neurodivergency?
Yeah, so it's very broad. Neurodivergency, the idea of it started actually in the 90s, and the concept first was around autism. So historically, we've looked at autism as there's a lot of words like deficits and delays. And in the late 90s, this concept of neurodiversity came out that essentially said, isn't that kind of normal? Like, we all look different, we all do different things after work, we all come from different backgrounds. Wouldn't it make sense that some people are going to communicate differently and learn differently and socialize differently? And so, after that kind of sparked additional conditions that are similar to autism in their representation of differences in socializing and learning were added under that umbrella. So common ones were like ADHD, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is where you can either be distracted easily or hyper focused on different things. Tourette's syndrome, dyscalculia, which is where numbers can be kind of difficult to read and calculate, dyspraxia, which is historically been looked at people who are clumsy, but essentially their brain just has a hard time communicating with their body and their movements, and dyslexia, which is where people have a hard time reading words, and sometimes those things can be jumbled. So those are some of the common conditions that are under the neurodiversity umbrella, but it's it's pretty broad, honestly.
Wow. Well, I have someone on my team who is dyslexic, and then I also have hired 2 people who had autism, varying spectrum, right? They were very focused. I could give them anything, and I mean, they would get the job done. The focus on that was just amazing. And then also, I raised 2 sons who were one was ADHD and one was ADD. So, I mean, I think all of us know people, like you said, and sometimes people are afraid to bring it up for themselves. But when we take all this into the workplace, what are the challenges that people are having who are neurodivergent with getting jobs? What are some of their key issues?
I think to start would just be the hiring process. So there are still a ridiculous amount of companies that focus on eye contact in interviews. And if somebody's not making eye contact, that's a red flag. Or if somebody just communicates a little bit differently, that can be a red flag. A lot of people who are autistic can be very direct. They also can they have a hard time reading between the lines sometimes, so if you try to be vague and hint at things, they're not gonna get it. But that's actually a benefit, like direct communication and all of these things that we're talking about, they're not negative, but the way that corporate's been built has kind of worked against people from this community, and several companies have started to realize, "Hey, that's actually an advantage." You mentioned dyslexia. And NASA actually had an entire dyslexia program because people who are dyslexic are really good with spatial reasoning. And there are several innovations that have happened for the entire world from NASA, from the individuals that were hired from that group. And so there's organizations that are starting to get it. If we just hire people who think the same way, we're going to get the same results. There's a huge benefit to hiring people who are going to think differently than us. It's Apple's whole slogan, right? Think different. That's how they've been able to constantly innovate because they were able to do that. And that's basically the concept of neurodiversity is people who think different. And their biggest barrier is organizations who aren't okay with that. They want everyone to think the same way, to work the same way. And that's where they run into issues. And so if somebody has to mask, which means hiding part of your identity, so if they have to mask in the interview process, they generally have to mask once they're employed. And so they if they're able to land the job once they're in the workplace, they're not getting the accommodations they need, whether that's like noise canceling headphones or dimmer lights, different things like that. And so burnout typically comes very fast and comes very severe. On the other hand, the organizations that actually do support this talent see astronomical retention rates. People with disabilities are very loyal and innovation increases with them. So, again, there's a lot of benefits. It's really just the structure of companies that has historically been in place that needs to change.
Wow. That is such great information. were identifying programs like DEI. We heard a lot about some of the workforce groups that were part of under the DEI umbrella. But neurodivergency really, I mean, when did that start?
So the term neurodiversity actually spiked 6,000% in the year 2021. And so for a lot of people, they started hearing about neurodiversity only in the last couple of years. Before, again, we just knew specific diagnoses. But a lot has changed in recent years with awareness, with people having access to education, diagnoses, things like that. And you're correct. In the DEI sphere, disability and neuro inclusion has kind of been the last to come through. And it's actually interesting with everything going on right now because it's one of the few areas that is still in place that actually hasn't been, speaking from the context of the United States, it hasn't been considered illegal DEI. So it's interesting it took so long to catch up, but now it's kind of one of the last remaining areas of inclusion that still is acceptable, if that's the right word to use.
That's interesting. Now, going back to, I remember in the late 90s, I was working with some guys who, of course, now the term autism, I mean, that has even spiked, right? And just the recognition of autism has spiked over the last, what, 10, 15 years maybe? I do recall, though, we went through this big period where ADD and ADHD, like I mentioned, was like the big thing to watch out for with your kids or study habits or people working and whatnot. So I'm kind of wondering now, we talk about the global legal framework here and how neurodiversity is still considered under the inclusion umbrella. One of the questions here that I want to talk to you about was what framework should companies be aware of regarding disability inclusion?
I want to share two separate lenses, right? Because there's obviously a lot going on in the United States, and I'm sure a majority of people listening will be in the United States. And it's important, again, to recognize that disability inclusion under the Americans with Disability Act, Section 503, Section 504, all of those still apply. So the current administration has reaffirmed their commitment to enforcing disability inclusion laws despite broader changes in DEI. So that is ensuring that organizations aren't discriminating in the hiring process. It's also ensuring that accommodations are offered by organizations for people with disabilities, and there still is enforcement in place to make sure that happens. So I think my call out to a lot of companies in the US would be don't forget that these things are still enforced and they're still important. In terms of the global framework, there's a lot of global legislation around this. In terms of accessibility across the European Union, across a lot of countries in APAC, there are laws in place that say you have to have your websites and your digital applications be accessible and usable for people from this community. And the European Union actually has taken it a step further. And actually, just this month, just a week ago, was the deadline for the European Accessibility Act. And essentially, that was saying that if organizations are going to put any new products out after this date, they have to be fully WCAG compliant, which is the most common standard for digital accessibility. And if not, they get big fines and they actually will lose their business licenses in European Union countries. So the stakes are raising. There's also hiring quotas in tons of countries: Brazil, Spain, Italy, France, Japan, Poland, just to name a few, that essentially say if you have more than a certain amount of employees, then usually 2 to 7% of your employee population needs to be disabled talent, and if they're not, you get really big fines as well. So, this is to address the fact that 80% of people with disabilities are unemployed globally. They actually have been identified by the United Nations as the most marginalized group globally, and I find it interesting because they always say that they have worse outcomes despite capabilities. And they say despite capabilities because the research shows that when you hire the people from this group, You have higher innovation, you have higher retention rates. There's no reason why not to. So we're starting to see a lot more legislation that's pushing organizations to really m move the needle here.
Plus, I mean, these people are goal oriented. I mean, I'm thinking of autism again. I mean, there's a lot of different categories under the neurodivergent banner. But when I think about the people I've hired, they work harder. Again, they're more focused. They're very deadline oriented. They want to make sure that they get things done by a certain time. So, I mean, in fact, I envy their sense of focus because I'm probably the opposite. I'm bing, bing all over the place. And I can give somebody with that particular disability if you wanna call it disability, do you call it
It
disability
is a
or
disability, yep. And that it's actually a lot of people have shied away from the word disability, but really it just means not being able to do something. And a lot of people, like I was alluding to earlier, a lot of people are disabled by their environment. Like my son is very sensitive to loud noises. I took him to a fair once, the fireworks went off, and he was on the ground, couldn't even communicate with me for about an hour. I take his headphones and he's playing with the kids and he's doing fine. So a lot of times for, again, people who are autistic, especially people who have invisible disabilities like autism, it's the environment that can really, really cause the barriers.
oh my gosh, okay. So, another question that comes up for me then, and you talked about Europe. So, how is Europe then incorporating then some of their digital accessibility modules for these people, and how is that working? I mean, can you give us an example of something?
Yeah, so it's supposed to be equal access to like digital services and certain physical services. So like ATMs, banking machines, those type of physical yet digital components that are in society for everyone to use, a lot of them are still not accessible for people from this community. And then there's also things like software and your websites when you're a company. So, what the enforcement said, there was quite a while of runway for companies to prepare for this, a couple of years. And they said after this June deadline, any new products that go out have to meet these standards. And if not, you're not in compliance. And then there's a sunset period that's still being decided for existing products. But a lot of organizations have just gotten ahead of it and started to make things more compliant. But really, when you think about it, it's just good business. This is 15% of the world's population. If you're building products that they can't even use, you're losing business. And universal design benefits everyone. There's something called the curb cut effect that basically is the phenomenon where if you design for people with disabilities, everyone benefits, and it is things like curb cuts that were originally designed for wheelchairs. All of a sudden, families pushing strollers and skateboarders are like, wow, this is convenient. Text to speech, closed captioning, elevators, so many things that you would never guess were designed for people from this community were, and they benefit everyone. And organizations that are getting ahead of it are already starting to see quick wins. And it's not just, "Oh, we gotta do this to be compliant and not get fined or lose business." It's actually helping them get more business.
Okay, I love that. That's a great example too of the cut curbs for people, all sorts of people have access. And you talk about a universal design. So that's what Europe has incorporated. Now, do you see that happening though and kind of waterfalling down to the United States?
Universal design is actually, a global principle, and there's definitely nowhere that's perfect at it, but I would actually say, uh, the European countries are a lot more progressive in this area than the Americas are.
And I've heard a couple of them brag about that too. Why is that?
Yeah, when it comes to actual support for people from this community, from the government, the United States actually lags a lot behind other countries in terms of helping them find employment, in terms of qualifying for disability and being able to be on disability, enforcement of accommodations policies, enforcement of like web standards. The Americans with Disabilities Act is still pretty new. I mean, I need to double check the date, but it was in the 90s. And now with all of the things going on in the United States, it's even though it's still in place, things are backsliding. And so they're backsliding before everything was really concrete in the first place. So a lot of progress was made, but there's still a long way to go.
Do you think it'll come back?
I sure hope so, and I'm doing everything I can to make sure it does.
You're not the only one. You're not. In fact, was it the CEO of Accenture has talked about rolling out some of the programs. I know they're trying to be careful with the language that's used around inclusion, right? Instead of using DEI. And I don't know why they have eliminated the acronym DEI. Of course, it was D and I, and then it was DEI. No, then it was DI and B, I think. And then it was DEI, right? So, I mean, the acronym itself has changed just over the last 15, 20 years.
Yep.
Just using the word inclusion, I think, is a great start to enforcing some of the programs that were already in place and working. Those programs shouldn't be stopped. And bringing up neurodivergency, I think, is so important. And I love what you said about the closed captioning because I use closed captioning all the time, especially on shows where you have like I love the British shows, and I
Mhm.
can't have understand half the things they're saying sometimes because their accents are so strong. Or shows from Ireland, right? Or Scotland. So we're using closed captioning all the time for just to understand what people are saying.
This curb cut effect phenomena, I mentioned that there's several companies that have invested in hiring from this space, and they've seen it too in their hiring. So let me give you some examples. Inclusive communication tools, so like having live captioning in meetings, accessible documents. Microsoft implemented that when they started doing their disability and neurodiversity hiring programs for people with disabilities. And then they did a survey across the whole company and found that 72% of their employees found that the captions help them focus better and retain information, regardless of hearing ability. And quiet or sensory friendly places, a lot of organizations have started having like low sensory rooms, and they've seen that while they were first designed for people who are neurodivergent, people who needed to pray for their religious beliefs had somewhere to go. Nursing mothers, or somebody who had a migraine, or somebody who just needed a break after a tough meeting, everyone's benefiting from them. And then the last one is just like clear and structured communication. Like I mentioned earlier, people who are autistic need very direct feedback, regular feedback. And Gartner did a study on big 5 companies that are focused on neurodiversity hiring, and they found that 70% of all employees at those companies had improved clarity because of that. So, again, you might think, "Oh, we don't wanna change these things, just hire from this community," but if you do, everybody benefits, just like the curb cuts.
Wow. I know for me, whenever I've worked in offices, the lighting has always been an issue for me. I was born cross-eyed. And so I've had my eyes operated on 3 times. You wouldn't know it by looking at me. But if I didn't have them operated on, one of them would be blind, the one I didn't use because I was severely cross-eyed. So to this day, like even in here, I don't like overhead lighting or fluorescent lighting has always bothered me. So I would take my own lamps to work when
Yeah.
I was working for companies so that I can have and people used to walk into my office and they'd go, "Ooh, I like it in here. It's so nice and calm and I like the lighting." And so other people started bringing lamps in. And it was funny what catches on. And nobody classified me as neurodivergent or having any kind of disability but I kind of did. I had this lighting issue because of my own vision issues.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's interesting. When you really kind of, like, hone it down in fact, whenever I've ever applied for anything that says, "Do you have a disability?" Or it'll say yes, no, or I prefer not to answer. I always hit prefer not to answer because I don't know. I mean, my eyes could have been my disability, right?
Yeah.
And still my sensitivity to lighting. I mean, if I'm in really severely bright light for a long time, I can get a migraine headache. So, I mean, there's so many of us are affected.
I can tell you that migraines are a disability, and that qualifies as disability, and I can tell you that the leading disability globally is depression. And so then we start getting into the mental health arena and recognizing again, let's think about the environment, how when we're spending a third of our lives at work and we know that this is the most common disability globally, how is our work environments affecting people who are experiencing that? So it is broad. Disability is broad. And again, it's not a bad word. I think people historically have shied away from it to try not to be offensive. Actually, the disability community prefers to be called disabled instead of using euphemisms or things like differently abled. A majority of people from the community, again, everybody's different, prefer to just call it how it is.
That is very interesting. So one of the things too, you talked a little bit about the political landscape here right now and how things have kind of shifted and hopefully that like we said come back. With the shift in the political climate though, let's talk about a surge in disability discrimination lawsuits.
Yeah, so a lot of it has to do with return to office. So during COVID, we saw an incredible increase in representation for people with disabilities. And again, a lot of it is that environment piece. For example, people who live in London and have to use the tube, the train system, their commutes on average are between 30 to 50% longer. And it's because if a elevator or lift is broken, they can't get to work and they have to go whole different area. I've seen instances before where there's a team dinner and the team shows up and nobody vetted it in advance and the person in the wheelchair has to go home. And so during COVID, the transportation barriers weren't there, the biases aren't there as much because you're not physically in person. And so this representation went up a lot. And then now a lot of places are having their workers return to office. And especially when you look at people who are autistic who were thriving working from home during the pandemic, suddenly they're being crammed back into offices and they're not able to be productive at work. And the lights, like you mentioned, and the sounds and everything going on. And a lot of the increase in disability discrimination claims are tied to you hired me to work remote, and now I need as an accommodation to work remote, and you won't let me, and I have a disability. And there have been cases, big companies, I'm not gonna say, but you can look it up, that have had to pay millions and millions of dollars for not letting a disabled employee work remotely.
I mean, we need to hear well, honestly, I think, it's just my opinion, but we should hear more of those stories so that companies can kind of check themselves at the door and say, "Hey, are we putting in place all of the accommodations that our community needs and people need?" I mean, because those accommodations, I mean, the list is like 6 feet tall, right? It's a lot there's a lot of accommodations that need to happen. But like you mentioned a while ago, everybody benefits from them. I mean, first of all, whoever invented fluorescent lights to begin with? I mean, I
Exactly.
yeah, nobody likes fluorescent lighting, right?
One thing that I wanna call out too is a lot of companies are super scared of accommodations. And 50% of workplace accommodations in the US are free. They don't cost anything. And the median cost for the remaining 50% is about 500 US dollars. And so accommodations that can make or break an autistic employee's experience could be I need meeting notes to be sent out. Turn on the AI companion on Zoom so that I can have things verbally and in writing. Or I need to wear noise canceling headphones. Like, very simple things to us, but that make a huge difference for someone's life who is living with neurodiversity and in an environment that isn't setting them up for success. So, I just always like to call that out, that it's not scary, it's not often burdensome for the employee either. I mean, for the employer, it's generally pretty straightforward.
Wow, Wesley, that's great information. It really is. And I mean, this, yeah, hopefully this podcast will hugely go viral. Yeah, let's talk about the ROI of accessibility now that we're on this subject. The ROI of accessibility and inclusive hiring. Let's talk about you talked about some of the economic benefits. How about, are there any success stories that you can share?
One that's coming to mind right now, just because we were talking about depression and well-being, There is a interesting case study by Genentech, which is a biopharmaceutical company, where during the pandemic, they invested in all these mental health resources and realized none of their employees were using them. And so they started this series called Let's Talk, where they had their leaders kind of just talk about their mental health. And all of a sudden, the utilization spiked. And they saw many other areas spike, including employees feeling safe, employees feeling like they belong. And this is such an interesting study. There was a WHO report that showed that workplace wellness programs that also include mental health support, have led to reduced absenteeism and improved well being for all employees with a $4 return on every $1 invested. So, again, these type of things end up benefiting everyone, and they actually end up benefiting the employer a lot. And so it's well worth the investment.
Wow, that's remarkable. It really is. Thank you so much for sharing all this. Anything else that we haven't covered yet that you would like to bring up?
I think the last thing that I would want to address is a common question that I get that maybe people listening might have. And you mentioned it earlier that there's been a rise in autism diagnoses. And we're seeing a lot of things about that on the news, especially in the political environment. And something a lot of people don't know is that with the DSM 5 in 2013, the diagnosis of autism actually changed. So there used to be autism, Asperger's, PDNOS. I need to to get that right, but there were 3 separate diagnoses. And essentially, before then, autism was reserved for more severe cases. So those were people who generally didn't speak and had much higher support needs. And people who were diagnosed with Asperger's could communicate, they just had maybe social challenges. After 2013, it became autism spectrum disorder. So you're taking 3 diagnoses and putting them now into one umbrella and giving them levels. And so I hear that often of like, why is everybody being diagnosed with autism these days? And I think it's just an important thing to note that, first of all, there's so much more awareness. Like I said, there's so much more access to resources, but also a lot of people aren't familiar with the fact that we've had 3 diagnoses turn into 1, and that is a big part of it as well. A lot of people have been neurodivergent their whole lives, and they're just being diagnosed in adulthood, especially women, because the criteria was made for men, and we now know that women present very differently. So I think the only message I'd wanna send is, especially with everything going on right now, if you're a part of that community, if you're feeling the heat, if you're not feeling validated, just know you're very valid. A lot of people don't have this information, and I think it's all of our job to kind of spread that awareness to help protect this community, especially during a time that's very difficult for them.
I'm really, really glad you bring this up, and thank you so much for sharing this information on autism. I was not aware of that. So I think that this is super helpful for people to understand. If somebody does want to find out more information, I mean, is there someplace they can go?
Well, my first recommendation would be Divergent Talent Consulting. But for real, I am here to answer any questions. My website is www.divergenttalentconsulting.com, and there's a lot of resources on there. But my biggest thing I would recommend is Disability In. They are the leading nonprofit globally for disability education for businesses, but they also have a lot of free content. They have an entire guide on how do you start an autism hiring program, what are the business case benefits for hiring people from these communities. They publish regular reports. They're also following legislation changes and publish regular reports for people to stay in the know. So that would be my biggest recommendation for people to learn more and also ensure they're staying informed when there's a lot shifting right now.
One last thing I wanna bring up, and you may have seen it. There's a movie called Temple Grandin, and it came out many years ago. And Temple Grandin is a woman who she's a PhD. I think she teaches at I think she's still a professor at the University of Colorado. She came up with the cattle calming, machines for tick dipping. And the reason that she came up with that is because as a child, she had autism pretty severely. And she used to go to her aunt's farm during the summer. And while she was there, she noticed that her aunt or her uncle and the people who worked on the farm would put the cattle in these like braces. And she would ask her aunt, well, why are they doing that? She said, well, it calms the cattle down. So she went and put herself in one of the cattle calmers. And I can't remember if they were trying to brand them at the time and trying to calm them down. I don't remember what the treatment was for the cattle, but they were in there. But what she did was when she was in college, she built her own little cattle calming machine for herself when she got overwhelmed, where she could go in and just lock herself into that and it would help calm her down. So later on, she was studying, I think, animal husbandry in college herself and saw that the cattle, some of them were drowning in the tick dips because they were just all getting flustered and they were just panicking, this cattle. And so they were losing some of them. And so she developed the cattle calming. I can't remember if it's a spiral or what it is, but where they would take the cattle and have them go kind of single file into the tick dipping to where they were, again, going through that whole entire press where they felt more enclosed, felt safer. And it started saving the lives of the cattle. It's an amazing, amazing movie. Have you ever heard of her?
Yes, I have, and I would honestly challenge anyone watching this to just look up inventions of people who are neurodiverse, and you'd be shocked. I mean, Elon Musk was diagnosed with Asperger's, which, as I just explained, is now technically autism. Richard Branson, the creator of Pokemon, so many innovators in space and science. It's largely been speculated Albert Einstein's
Oh,
autistic,
yeah. I had heard that.
and again, when you have somebody who can think differently and approach problems differently, that's where innovation happens. And that's what we've seen in these instances too. And so I'm really glad you shared that because yeah, if we keep going the way that we're going, we would still have that same way of doing things and we wouldn't have the innovations that Temple Grandin brought in. So,
Wesley, thank you so, so much for this. This has been enlightening. It really has. I really appreciate you being my guest.
of course, thank you for having me.
All right. And anybody that needs to reach out to Wesley, give us it one more time.
www.divergenttalentconsulting.com.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Wesley.
Thank you.